Welcome to Coast to Coast. My name is Lily Weinberg, and I'm here joined by my colleague Lillian Corral. Hey, Lillian, how's it going?
Good, Lily. How are you?
I'm doing well. I was kind of in shock when I saw this is episode 25 of Coast to Coast. So we've been doing this for a while, really looking at the trends of cities, the rapid change that has occurred as we think about informed and engaged communities, and really what the future looks like, and what does recovery look like in our cities. Last month, we looked at public spaces, and we had some really rich information from that evaluation that we released. And now we're going into your expertise around digital engagement within communities and within municipalities. And so I'm really excited for this topic. So what are your thoughts, and what are you excited to dig into?
Well, I'm really excited to dig into three cities that are working through the challenges of digital engagement, right? I mean, as you and I know, it's been a really, well, as everybody probably listening to, so it's been a really difficult year, right? And cities had to not only move their own operations to a work from home, more digital environment, but then they also had to really keep up with the difficult job of connecting with residents and keeping that connection alive and going. And it just reminds me, the communication between government and resident is a core part of our democracy, and it can't be something you sort of forget about, right? And so what I'm excited about is these three individuals have really been pushing on that. Both helping to advance their city's digital strategy, but then really leaning onto what is the best way to keep that connection alive and going, because we know that it's something that's not that hasn't been mastered by any one sector per se, right? Like a lot of different industries, government just being one of them. If you consider it sort of like an industry, everyone is struggling to figure out how do they keep that digital touch, and authenticity, empathy, trust is such a critical part of it. So today we're really going to delve into more than a year after the COVID shutdown. How is government maintaining that connection? What are the practices that are changing the way that it's sharing information, engaging residents, and building trust? And that to me seems like a really great meaty discussion.
And that trust piece is really interesting to dig into. Like, how do we do that? Like, how do cities build that trust, during a rapid change and in a digital nature? So I'm really interested to hear what our guests are going to say.
And especially because we know, obviously, we didn't start from a place of trust either, right? And so it's and now you have to do it through this medium that in many ways is filled with information, some of it correct, some of it not. And it's also much more distant. And so how do we build that in person? So let's welcome our guests. So first, joining us is Ryan Hanschen from the City of Boulder. He's an engagement specialist there, leading one of their key programs. We have Emily Yates, who's the Smart Cities Director in the City of Philadelphia, and Katherine Estrada, Training Officer for the City of San Jose. Their invitations are their bios are in the invitation and on the website, and folks can learn more about them. And the way that this is going to work is you and I are going to lead this interview for about 25 minutes, and then we're going to take live questions. So for those of you joining us live, please put your questions in the chat box or through Facebook or Twitter using the hashtag #NightLive, and we'll be able to get those questions and share them with our guests.
Perfect. Yay. Great. Well, welcome. And let's get this interview started. It'll be rapid fire for the next 25 minutes. And then, like Lillian said, we'll open it up. So first I want to start with some context setting, and really understand, get some background from each of you around what you've been up to. So let's start with Ryan. Tell us a bit about Boulder's community connectors model. How did this idea emerge, and how has it been employed during the pandemic?
Absolutely, thank you. And we really appreciate the opportunity to elevate the work of our community connectors, which is entering its third year here and really focused on supporting a culture change within our city, and really looking at elevating the voices of underrepresented community members and co-designing engagement, that build trusts and increases two-way dialogue. And so this model really features community members partnering with the city and community connectors are paid for their dedication, their time, and their expertise. And coming into last March, we really saw that the need for the model in emergency response. And after devastating floods in 2013 in the area, saw big gaps in engagement and in equity, and wanted to make sure to have a model that was sharing accurate updates and basic needs resources, as well as surfacing issues from community members as well.
Fantastic. And I think you make a really, there's a very basic point that you made, Ryan, around paying community members too to participate, which I think is a really important point that we can dig into. But thanks for that context setting. I want to move to Kat. So please tell us about your work as part of the Emergency Operations Center for the City of San Jose. What have been the modes for sharing information with the public, and what have you learned are the most effective ways of engaging the public?
Absolutely, and thank you for the question. So just for a little context setting for those who might not know, San Jose is an incredibly diverse city, over 1 million residents, dozens of languages spoken at home, and we have this capital of Silicon Valley moniker, but we're also a hub for recent immigrants of all walks of life. At the beginning of this pandemic, we knew we had a key role to play in amplifying all sorts of public health messages and to do so in relevant languages. Website updates, press releases, social media posts have been some of our ongoing tactics. And with those, we really saw that we had highest engagement when we had straight talk messaging, right? If you are this age, this is how you make an appointment. You are eligible, make an appointment. So just really simplifying it down to what is actionable, readily accessible, and in relevant language. We also had mixed success in asking local influencers to record and share safety messages, best practices, encourage people to get tested, etc. We're very excited about an upcoming effort in partnership with Knight Foundation to leverage even additional messengers within our community who have more of that trusted touch outside of the existing city communications mechanism. In terms of answering the question of what's been most effective in engaging our residents, I can't tell you that there's one silver bullet. I think it's just recognizing that we have a community that has different needs, different connections, and how do we try to have that array of tactics that address as many of those cross sections and reach as many of those cross sections of the community where they are at as possible.
That's great context setting, and really excited about our partnership, and we'll dig into that more, but certainly a complex issue, like you said, and crosses so many different fields. So let's move on. Emily, you are leading Philadelphia's Smart Cities work in the Office of Innovation. And while you're not charged with managing public information, you're playing a critical role around the innovation piece. So tell us a bit about what you're doing, and start by describing the challenges of the city and what you're trying to address when it comes to information sharing and engagement during the pandemic. I know that's a big question, but would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, thanks for having me as part of this conversation. We would not be on this journey if it wasn't for Knight Foundation's support. So always glad to participate in these really critical conversations. In terms of kind of where we're at in Philadelphia, so to help set the context as well, we are a population of 1.5 million, a growing city, but also dealing with some challenges around socioeconomics. A quarter of our population lives at or below federal poverty level, which really plays into how we think about engaging our communities. It's definitely a challenge because there's also a fair portion of our population that doesn't have access to appropriate technology or connectivity. And so when COVID hit, we were really, just everything that we had been dealing with was amplified. It highlighted even more so the social inequities in terms of where we saw COVID, clusters of COVID positivity. And then we also really amplified that digital divide. And so it shifted the way that we as a city wanted to engage our communities. We knew immediately that we needed to develop a digital divide project, and we've been really working really hard on that, and that's been successful. But it's also adjusted our lens of how we engage. And in terms of the smart city space, when this happened and the Black Lives Matter uprising happened, there was a lot of conversation, which was awesome to be a part of, around, well, what does smart cities mean? in this post-COVID Black Lives Matter uprising space where we are seeing these social inequities, and it's not about the shiny objects, but really how can we be more thoughtful? And so we've deployed a lot of projects that address either social inequities, building trust with our government and community, or budget, to be honest, because that's also something that affects all of our citizens. And so we've got a few projects, too. Large credit to Knight Foundation for supporting those. But one of the ones we're focusing on is collecting data and at a granular level. A lot of cities don't have block by block level about the built environment and the impact that that has. This is one I'm excited about because we're trying to have a conversation where we take this data and engage the community to co-create interventions for their neighborhoods. And specifically targeting 2 of the zip codes that have the highest levels of homicide and violence, because we know improving the quality of the public space can actually reduce the levels of violence and homicides. And we want to bring the police into this conversation to help co-create, to build that level of trust between the police and the community and really shift that perspective of defund the police conversations that are happening. And that's a really unique way of engaging the community. We clearly aren't there yet, but that's our intent with collecting this data. That's so granular. We have a project that we're deploying around real-time video translation of over 200 languages and dialects, as well as American Sign Language, that is being taken on site. So we're partnering with our community action team out of the fire department to really connect with the individuals that are dislocated. That's not the correct word, but they're going through an emergency where they can't go home and they need to access city services, and they might not speak English as their first language. And so we wanted to make sure that we're able to connect with them effectively, develop trust in that way. But then we're also working with our rebuild team to use these in community meetings where they're going out into communities to determine how to improve our parks and rec spaces or our libraries. And I think there was a feeling that they were not getting quality information, or the community wasn't feeling heard because they couldn't speak in their native language. And so it was much more disjointed. And then the last one that's much more internal facing, but has a massive impact on our community, is partnering with a company called Zen City to track the sentiment of our city. I think when COVID hit, we were seeing a lot of chatter, and these were internal conversations where we're seeing chatter around disappointment in our trash collection and communication around that, disappointment in the vaccination strategy and how we initially started to roll that out. And what we saw was an opportunity to utilize technology and innovation, in this case, AI, machine learning, to collect sentiment across the internet. It's all publicly available information, and kind of track it and determine how our messaging is hitting the community, and either being proactive in terms of messaging that we launch, or using it to take feedback into policies that we're developing or messaging that we've already issued, and use it to readjust our messaging a little bit more.
That's a great in-depth understanding of how a city can take that already publicly available data and do something with it, Emily, and be proactive about it. Let's jump off of that to talk to Ryan and Kat about your work is really focused on, working with actual residents to push the messages out. So once a city has access to all this data, perhaps all this sentiment, and now wants to message out, in both of your models, you're working with the actual residents to push the information out. We've talked a lot about trust. Can you tell us more about, in this digital environment where there's so much information, right? It's information overload, and there's constantly changing information, right? Especially around the vaccine, around COVID. How do you build trust with those messengers and preserve it as all of that is shifting? And then perhaps as you're answering that, just, maybe tell us a little bit more specifically about how you're working with those residents so that we all have a good understanding of what your program is. Ryan, why don't you take it away?
Absolutely. I think a big part of that is really meeting community members where they are. And, if folks need access to an internet hotspot, then let's help distribute those. Thinking about digital engagement, if that is, a bilingual texting platform that has two-way communication, if that's Spanish first Facebook page, if that's making sure that information is, in graphics and JPEGs that are really easy to share by text or by WhatsApp or other social media platforms. I think a big thing that we really found was making sure that we could offer emergency response connectors and community members, little nuggets that we could boil down all of this information that was coming from the city and the county and the state and the federal level, and really have, these are the bite-sized pieces of information that's going to help protect your family and help share, access to resources. And I think one example that we saw of really building trust, was last April when City Council voted to have a mask mandate, across our city. And we heard from so many families that said, we don't have access to masks, and we're not able to afford the fabric for making the masks ourselves. And the city was able to invest and contract with a community organization to employ out-of-work community members to make those masks. And then looking at disparities within our Latinx community, really make sure that those were distributed with an equity lens to community members who needed those most. And I think that really opened the door to demonstrate that the city has your back, and we want to continue engaging in a few of these other ways as well.
Kat, you're on mute.
I'm say that I'm in awe of just what Boulder's doing. That's awesome in terms of building trust and really putting the actions there. I think our focus in San Jose has really been on the, leveraging the trusted messenger and being the support they need to feel confident that, yes, their voice matters in this conversation, that they are a leader in their community and people are looking to them for information and they are a trusted source of information. Providing that it's an expectation of, we're asking you to share this message, which has been vetted by, public officials, etc. And, we're not asking you to take on trolls or to address every myth or, every bit of, misinformation that might come across you, but also being a support in the event that you are getting those questions you're feeling like you should be able to respond to, but you're not sure. So I think it's like being kind of a coach or a parent to an extent, and that providing the structure and the support of, this is what we're asking you to do. Don't feel like you need to take this on also, has been part of our message in working with trusted community partners to help spread the message.
Great. Emily, in your program, it sounds like, first of all, you're all talking about not just communicating out, but actually, like, as you hear something, taking action, which is very different from like a public information option, action, right? It's, you're hearing that masks are needed, or you're hearing that Wi-Fi is an issue, and then you're going and addressing the digital, you're helping to kind of connect and address the digital divide as part of your overall engagement strategy. So that's really interesting. And then it sounds like you're also creating a feedback loop that is both pushing information out, hearing back from the resident, taking the action, and as you're hearing that, and taking that back into the organization, Emily, in a program like yours, how are you accounting for a lot of the kind of variation in data and feedback that you get, right? People always talk about, like, you look at YouTube comments or Facebook comments for the city, and it just is such a wide variability of things that are constructive and not. How does your work try to make sense of all of that? And in some ways, I guess my question is, some of those trolls are just as valid. They're residents of our cities. They have just as valid a point of view in many ways as someone who is offering some concrete, constructive feedback. But as a city in this digital environment, how are you making sense of that and dealing with all of that?
So I think that's where it's been great to partner with Zen City. Their platform looks at such a broad variety. We're taking in so many data points that we can really start to look at the trends and aggregate the data a bit more, so that it removes kind of the random peaks or the random point of data and really tracks where a large point of feedback is, I guess. So we're trying to present it as part of a broader toolkit where we are noticing these trends. We can set up projects where, if we know we're going to be launching, another effort around our K through 12 digital divide. We can track what we're seeing. Is it positive? Is it neutral? Is it negative? And then we can start to drill down in the data if we see that there's like a peak in negative data after we've launched that messaging, and then use that with valuable insights from the Zen City team to really try to readdress what the messaging we're getting out. And I think the key thing for this is that by doing kind of the trend, the hope is that we will reach a large amount of people and let them know that their voice is being heard. Whereas before they were just kind of going off into the net, the web, and not really being heard. If we're saying we are consistently hearing this, we either need to redirect our efforts or this is in line with what we're already doing. I think that helps build the trust that the community wasn't feeling was happening as much early on in COVID.
Thank you. That's a great answer. I sort of have a quick follow-up, which is how quickly do you have to act, if you will, in order to retain that trust? Like, so people say something, you're aggregating that data. I mean, how quickly are you in some ways responding so that they feel heard? Is there a sense of that?
I wouldn't say there's a sense of that. I think we're always trying to respond as quickly as possible as a city, but it depends on what the action is that we're doing to address what we hear. If it's a policy, it takes a little bit longer, but we have to go through the proper mechanisms and protocol. But I think part of it is also saying we've heard, this is what we're hearing, and trying to use the time between hearing and policy development or project development and kind of having a feedback loop with the community or trying to pull more data. In my opinion, that's kind of the ideal way to do that.
Great. I think this is a good opportunity to kind of shift into a bit of a post-COVID direction, which is because we're sort of at that period where we're starting to transition in some ways out of the COVID response and into recovery. Kat, we talked about the fact, you and I have talked about the fact that there is a sense that the pandemic has shifted service delivery to kind of a digital only strategy. And you've rightly corrected me that that's not entirely true. And so can we talk a bit more about the misperception or the feeling that now we've gone digital and digital only can or should be the way to approach communications and engagement moving forward?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for asking the question, because it's definitely something where we know it's the low-hanging fruit. We know it's instant and it's easy to put things online, right? But we also know that at best in San Jose, which is a pretty digitally connected city, we're talking to maybe half of our households via all of our different platforms and all of our different reach, which means we have 500,000 people we're not directly talking to. And so we can't just say, oh, because they didn't come find us, then that's enough, right? We have to figure out how to reach people where they're at, and that we need to recognize that digital communication isn't the silver bullet. We have different people with different levels of understanding of what San Jose has to offer for them and what services are available and how to access them. And we need to make sure that we're still keeping some traditional means regarding, direct mail and lit drops, or, even phone calls or knock and talks, just making sure that we create those avenues that are particularly seeking to make sure we're communicating with our, recent immigrant populations, our older adult residents, many of whom still aren't online or haven't had that opportunity to have access. So just being able to be sure that we're not purposely leaving people out in how we design our communications is definitely very important.
Great. Lily, I know we're starting to get some questions from the audience. I don't know if you want to maybe share one of those with our guests. Oh, you're on mute. Zoom bingo.
You would think I would learn. But I think this builds upon the last question, Kat. You touched upon this a little bit, but there is a question from the audience around what kind of demographic information do you find you're most successful in reaching with your efforts? What do you think contributes to those differences? So Kat, you want to?
Yeah, I can take the first swing at that. So I would say a couple of factors. One, that San Jose kind of has this like biggest small town aura about it. There are a lot of people who are connected to the city already, just long-term family history here, connections, etc. So you kind of have that aspect. Then you also have, again, there is a tech divide that is still real. You have a wealth divide that is still very real. And so you're finding that, our more affluent residents tend to be the ones who are most connected to the city mechanism, right? And so our goal is to let's help get others online as well. So we do have a whole, digital implementation strategy and, connectivity type of programs. But we're also recognizing that that's still not getting to everyone. And we definitely need to be very conscious about, are we still utilizing traditional means of communication and engagement to have opportunities for residents to talk with us and to, know what services are available.
Ryan or Emily, do you want to jump in with any of your thoughts?
Sure, I'm happy to. I think it's really about a whole suite of opportunities to engage digitally and otherwise. And, whether that be the Be Heard Boulder platform where folks can share their thoughts on upcoming projects and share their perspectives, to many social media channels, to other community newsletters and ways of getting information out. But knowing that some of those will want to make sure to co-create with community members, because they may know best, what is going to work with engaging our Nepali community, right? Or what will be most culturally relevant for our Latinx communities. And so really putting a focus on making sure that community member voice is a big part of designing and evolving what's coming next.
Yeah. I mean, that's right. And so, Emily, I want to pivot a little bit and go a bit deeper into the recovery piece and how cities are just fundamentally going to potentially be shifting. We heard from Kat, not everything, but there are going to be some shifts. And so I'd love to dig a little bit deeper there with you and your thoughts there. So every city, has had to pivot towards a digital first approach over the last year. What do you think you've gotten right? And what are some of the I would call them hard lessons learned over this past year?
So I think, everything that Ryan and Kat said was spot on, and there are things that we're experiencing here. I think we pivoted quickly and really worked hard to get a lot of our critical services digital. We also really tried to engage with the community early on to understand what was needed. I think some of the hard lessons that we learned were that even if it's digitally provided, it doesn't mean we're getting the results or the engagement that we want, that we really have to have a broad toolkit of ways to engage the community that don't always necessarily include digital. So there's still value in going out door to door or sending mailers out to engage. I think when we were deploying the K through 12, or when we're still deploying it, but the K through 12 efforts, we thought, okay, well, as long as we call these people, we'll be able to get them signed up really quickly. And what we ended up finding out was that if it had multiple steps or required multiple kind of phone calls, that was not as successful for the communities that we were trying to target. So we tried to simplify the process, and we still didn't have a massive uptake of it, or as much as we wanted to, rather, because people don't have the time, or the hours of availability didn't work with their hours outside of work or whatnot. So I think just the hard lesson was that it's not, there's no simple fix, that we really have to be innovative, which was probably a great lesson learned, to be honest. The city realized how innovative we can actually be in a short period of time. But I think, being innovative in how we engage, it doesn't only mean text messages or emails. I think that there are also, and this is something that the Knight Foundation has been really kind of leading, is thinking through creative ways. Is gamification a better way to engage certain demographics that wouldn't be interested in responding to text messages and emails? And so kind of just lessons learned, or we have to continue to learn.
Yeah, that is a good lesson learned. I do just have a follow up with that, Emily. How are you thinking through? I mean, there's a massive amount of infrastructure dollars that are pouring into the Rescue Act, and then of course future infrastructure dollars. So how are you thinking about those dollars and linking to some of your agenda items that you had around smart cities and digital engagement?
Man, is this the conversation of the hour in cities right now?
Yeah.
And everybody's vying for it. Everybody's got an infrastructure project. I think the way I'm looking at it is, what are some basic systems that we need to improve internally that would really help engage and make life easier for our citizens and our residents? But I'm also looking at better, I think one of the areas that I want to focus on in the next few years in this position is better connecting departmental efforts for efficiencies, and recognizing that if we're doing things in the smart city space, that they have economic impact and that they have environmental impact, and bringing those people more into the conversations and really trying to find creative ways to develop partnerships to drive this innovation, this collaborative innovation. So we're talking, I'm trying to kind of begin an innovation hub here where we start to look at, challenges that every city faces around climate, mobility, food systems, circularity, and whatnot, and really kind of create a hub where we bring in all of the resources that we have in the city around the universities, our private sector, our foundations, and whatnot, and try to drive innovation in that space.
Yeah, it's the multi-million-dollar question that every city's thinking about. I would love to invite Kat, if you have thoughts on that, how you're thinking about linking to infrastructure dollars, and Ryan too. So Kat, do you have any thoughts?
I completely agree that it's the multi-million-dollar question right now, right? Of kind of how do we smartly invest those dollars that we know are coming, and building forward our communications infrastructure. So I don't have a good answer. Definitely just wanted to echo that it's definitely at the top of mind for so many cities right now.
Yeah. There's a good related question here in the chat about city budgets. I think, Emily, you started with, throwing that out as, city budgets are often overlooked as a way to impact change. Is any of this communication having any impact on the allocation of city funds? Do you see the potential to actually create that connection back, especially with data programs? So maybe I actually will throw it to Ryan, because I know your program is actually 3 years old and has been sort of trying to create a lot of the mechanism for feedback and change.
Yeah. Thinking back to our initial test of the Community Connectors model, was funded externally. And once we were able to prove that model, we did see investment from inside the city, and now we're seeing, other departments seeking their own Community Connector teams for some of the engagement that they're doing. Maybe that's part of working groups, but really seeing that, we're able to build that and, increase, that proof of concept and really show that, look, this is, having different results than we've really had in the past. And we're hearing from different voices and community members who have been hard to reach in the past. And
are you seeing elected leadership or leadership of the city being responsive to, again, the priorities that are coming through from that engagement? Or do you think it's still that next piece of investment and changing in the way we allocate city funds? Is that we still have a ways to go there?
I think we really have seen our elected leaders be really supportive of this work. And for example, our council just reviewed their priorities, 12 or 13 priorities for this year. And then Community Connectors really reached out to community members and say, okay, of these topics, which are going to have the most impact on communities of color? And then taking those top 5, we were able to really say, all right, as we're piloting the city's racial equity instrument, those are going to be the top 5 that we are starting with. And so really making sure that we're lifting up those voices and saying, yes, like we are listening to what the community is saying and we're putting that into action right away.
Great. And there's actually a link out to the description of the Community Connectors program on the web for folks joining us to see. The last question from the audience is very related. Not all elected leaders are interested in hearing the voice of their community. How can people in other cities bring these programs into those cities? I don't know your reactions to the question, but maybe any also advice on how to start up these kinds of initiatives.
I mean, I'll start with just first expressing my disappointment that there are elected leaders who don't want to hear from the people they represent, right? And I think that there's some mindset and some training and some shifting of culture that can happen there, even just within the mechanism. So I really hope that there's opportunities in these communities where you're experiencing that to really highlight the value of engagement with your community and, you know, highlight examples of success, such as what we're talking about today. So I would say that's a key first step, but also that ultimately, you know, just really talking with your electeds about, you know, this is helping your community. These are engineering wins for your community. This is better serving our public, and reconnecting them to that value is something that would be my first conversation.
Brian, I think you're on mute.
Can you hear me now? Okay, to add to that, you know, I think really making the case that the city is going to make better decisions when the voice of community is centered in that. And how can we make sure that we're centered lived experience so that we can make those better decisions? And then I think another piece of that too, maybe, you know, many elected leaders in many communities hear from many frequent flyers and, you know, frequent participants who know how to navigate systems of community engagement already. And how can we work to reduce those barriers to community engagement so that more community members are able to share their voices and bring different perspectives into the room as well.
And I would just add, I think elected leaders are oftentimes very risk adverse. You know, they're very comfortable in their positions. And so if you can identify an internal champion and start small, we're big on pilots in Philadelphia for that reason. But if you can prove the value of what you're doing and align it with what their priorities are, I've had a lot of success in moving forward projects in that way. Just because your message is not your, let me rephrase that. Your intention might be to better hear the voices of the community, but there are other ways to pitch it to your elected officials if that becomes a problem, that still gets you the result of getting other people's voices at the table as well.
Yeah, that's a great, yeah. The aligning priorities, that is really a great point. So I want to ask we're close to time. We still have roughly about another 5 minutes, but I want to ask a looking forward question, and we'll do a round robin on this. So Pew's latest research shows that just 20% of U.S. adults say they trust the government in Washington to do the right thing. So 20%, just about always or most of the time. From our perspective, can this greater emphasis on digital increase access to government information and trust? And what needs to keep improving the public's perception of government? So I'd love to start with you, Kat.
Sure. I absolutely think that this needs to be part of government's platform moving forward. And for it to be successful, it has to be dynamic. It has to be timely. It has to be straight talk messages. I think that what you'll find is local governments will have some hiccups in actually keeping up with the speed of information, and that we're usually fairly thinly staffed in our communications mechanisms. And as we increase these engagement efforts, we have to be able to keep up with the speed of conversations. So I think there's going to be some learning in that for local government. But, back to the budget question, is it the priority to continue engaging? Hopefully it is. And, we continue building up those mechanisms in which to continue meeting our community in real time with straight talk messages.
Okay. So you feel optimistic?
I feel optimistic, particularly at the local government level. Can definitely understand where that percentage might be a little bit lower with federal government from recent experience.
Ryan, you want to go next?
Sure. Absolutely feeling optimistic. And, I recall a conversation with a community connector, a few months back, and who said, I moved to this community 20 years ago, and this is the first time that I've felt listened to, and that my community has really felt listened to. And I think we're, really just beginning and continuing along this road. And making sure that two-way dialogue is a part of this process. And I think another piece of that is really ensuring that we are closing the loop with community, that when we're asking for input, we're sharing how that's going to be used. We're sharing, if that wasn't used, why, but really being clear about, here's kind of the next steps after you've engaged with your local government.
Yeah. Emily, you want to jump in?
Yeah, no, I think I wouldn't be in this position if I wasn't excited about the future of digitalization of city governments. I think the challenge and the tension is always going to be that there's that disconnect in human connection when you're using technology. And so how do you maintain the authenticity and the transparency and that feedback loop, and doing it in a way that allows people to feel heard? I think the other challenge with it is that cities are not the best at claiming when they're wrong. We don't want to be wrong as cities, but I think that there's a human component to that, right? And I think that there's value in cities owning if they make a mistake. And I think that goes a long way with the community as well, especially as we move towards a more digital and a fast-paced life. So those would be kind of my thoughts on that.
Yeah.
Great. Well, what a fascinating conversation. I'll just pull up a couple points and then thank you all for joining us. I mean, it definitely sounds like, the age-old model, meet people where they're at. That's a real critical piece here. We're meeting people where they're at, and that you're really looking at communication, not as just you communicating out to the public, but you really engaging your residents in sharing information and them being part of that that dialogue. That seems to be a strategy that's really working. And then the last piece I think you just mentioned, Emily, around authenticity and the feedback loop, right? Like you can't really be authentic if you're not going to do anything with that info. And you have to kind of deal with the barriers of digital to build that authenticity. But I think investing in it and being willing to innovate, to risk, to try things seems like a great opportunity to kind of move that two-way dialogue forward. So thank you all so much for your time, and thanks everyone for joining us. Lily, I don't know if you want to say anything else.
No, that was the perfect closing. I mean, and it's not complicated. I mean, it is complicated, but the things that we think about doing engagement in person need to be translated also for digital engagement. And so meeting people where they are, just what you said. So thank you so much, Ryan, Emily, and Kat, and Lillian. I'll see you next month.
See you next month. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.